The moonlight was bright on that cold October night in 2045. Mrs. Park walked slowly along the empty road outside Seoul, carrying her grocery bags. At 75 years old, she took her time, enjoying the quiet evening air. After 40 years in Atlanta, America, being back in Korea felt both strange and familiar. 3 teenagers watched her from behind an old building. Lee Do-han, the tallest of the group, gripped a baseball bat tightly. Kim Ji-soo played with her phone, recording everything. Park Ta-min, the youngest at 15, stood nervously behind them. "Look at her, acting like she belongs here," Do-han said in a low voice. "She lived in America so long, she's not even Korean anymore." Mrs. Park stopped to rest, setting her bags down on a bench. She took out her phone, its blue light shining on her face as she typed a message to her granddaughter. "I'm doing well here, Mireille," she wrote. "But sometimes I feel like a stranger in my own country." She pressed send, not knowing these would be her last words to her family. The teenagers moved closer. Their shadows stretched long across the ground. Do-han had told his friends that Mrs. Park was rich and kept money in her house. But that wasn't the real reason they were there. They had seen her talking to American tourists in English, helping them find their way. They had watched her shop at the foreign food store. In their minds, she didn't belong. Mrs. Park heard footsteps behind her. Before she could turn around, something hard hit her back. She fell forward, her phone cracking on the ground. The blue light flickered and died. "Please," she said in Korean, her voice shaking. "Take my money. Take everything." Ji-soo kept recording as Do-han hit Mrs. Park again. Tai-min stood frozen, his hands shaking. This wasn't what they had planned. This wasn't supposed to happen. "Stop," Tai-min whispered. "Do-han, stop." But Do-han wasn't listening. His eyes were wild, filled with a hatred he didn't understand. Ji-soo laughed nervously, her phone steady in her hands. They dragged Mrs. Park to the construction site nearby. The ground was soft from recent rain. Do-han had found shovels there earlier that day. He threw one to Ta-min. "Dig," he ordered. Ta-min's hands trembled on the shovel. "She's still breathing," he said. "Dig," Do-han shouted. They dug for 30 minutes. Mrs. Park lay quietly on the ground, barely moving. Sometimes she whispered words they couldn't understand. Once she said something that sounded like numbers, a strange series of codes. The hole grew deeper. Ji-soo's phone battery died, but by then it was too late to stop. They were all part of it now. When they finished, Do-han rolled Mrs. Park into the hole. She looked up at the 3 teenage faces above her, her eyes clear and calm. Then she said something that made them all freeze. "I forgive you," she said in perfect Korean. But they won't. Before they could ask who they were, Do-han started pushing dirt into the hole. Tai-min helped, tears running down his face. Ji-soo stood guard, looking for anyone who might pass by. None of them noticed the strange blue light that began pulsing under Mrs. Park's skin. None of them saw the small metal device behind her ear start to glow. And none of them felt the invisible signal that shot up into the night sky, bypassing all of Earth's satellites, heading toward something much, much farther away. When they finished, the ground looked almost normal. 3 teenagers stood in the moonlight, covered in dirt, changed forever by what they had done. They didn't know that this was just the beginning. They didn't know that Mrs. Park was more than just an old woman. They didn't know that somewhere, far beyond Earth's atmosphere, something had received her last signal. And they didn't know that in exactly 6 hours, everything they understood about their world would change forever. Detective Yoon Ha-won arrived at the construction site early the next morning. Workers had found something strange while checking the ground. All their electronic equipment had stopped working at the same time. When they started digging to check for broken power lines, they found Mrs. Park. Ha-won stood at the edge of the hole, writing notes in her small black notebook. Unlike the other police officers, she still used paper and pen. She didn't trust computers much, and today that seemed wise. Every phone and tablet within 50 feet of the site was dead. Time of death? She asked the medical team. That's the strange part, said Dr. Kim, looking confused. According to our tests, she died just minutes ago. But the dirt in her lungs shows she was buried last night. Hai-Wen frowned. That wasn't possible. No one could survive being buried for hours. She looked at Mrs. Park's body again. Something blue glowed faintly behind the old woman's ear, but when Hai-Wen blinked, it was gone. A black car pulled up to the site. A woman stepped out, wearing a United States Space Command uniform. She walked straight to the police line, her boots making no sound on the gravel. I'm Dr. Han Mi-Ray, she said, showing her badge. Mrs. Park was my grandmother. Hai-Wen studied the young woman's face. She looked Korean, but something about her movements seemed different, almost too smooth. I'm sorry for your loss, Hai-Wen said. But how did you get here so quickly? We haven't even called the family yet. Mi-Ray smiled slightly. Grandmother had safety measures in place. I was notified automatically when her heart stopped. Before Hai-Wen could ask more questions, all the dead phones around them suddenly turned on. They showed the same video. 3 teenagers, a baseball bat, an old woman falling. The video played on every screen, even the construction workers' broken equipment. Find them, Mi-Ray said quietly. Her eyes had changed color, turning slightly blue. Find them quickly, detective. Before they start changing. Changing? Hai-Wen asked. What do you mean? But Mi-Ray was looking at the sky. Dark clouds were gathering, even though the weather report had promised a clear day. The air felt charged, like just before a lightning storm. At that moment, in 3 different homes across the city, 3 teenagers woke up screaming. Their skin felt like it was on fire. Behind their ears, small blue lights began to pulse. Du-Han tried to look at himself in the mirror, but the glass cracked as soon as he got close. Jisoo's phone kept showing the video she had recorded, playing it over and over, even after she took out the battery. Tai-Min lay in his bed, crying, as memories that weren't his filled his mind. Memories of a life in Atlanta, of facing hatred, of secrets kept for decades. Back at the construction site, Mi-Ray touched her grandmother's hand one last time. A spark jumped between them, visible in the growing darkness. You didn't tell them what you were, she whispered in English. You didn't tell them about the changes that would come if they heard you. Why didn't you warn them, grandmother? Hai-Wen watched as Mi-Ray stood up. The young woman's uniform had begun to shimmer, like it was made of something that wasn't quite cloth. Detective, Mi-Ray said, we have 6 hours before they complete their first transformation. Find them. Bring them here. After that, she looked at the dark clouds overhead. After that, Earth's rules won't matter anymore. Lightning flashed across the sky, and in that bright moment, Hai-Wen saw Mi-Ray's true form reflected in a puddle. She gasped and stepped back. But when the thunder faded, Mi-Ray looked normal again. The hunt for 3 teenagers had begun. But Hai-Wen realized she wasn't just solving a murder anymore. She was trying to prevent something much bigger, something that would change her world forever. Detective Yoon Ha-Won found the first teenager, Tai-Min, hiding in his school's basement. He sat in a corner, his hands covering his face. When she turned on her flashlight, she saw that his skin was changing color, shifting between different shades like a chameleon. Make it stop, Tai-Min begged. The memories, they won't stop. What memories? Hai-Wen asked, keeping her distance. I see Atlanta in 1960. I feel a hate. I feel everything she felt. Tai-Min looked up, and his eyes glowed blue like Mrs. Park's had. I know what she was now. I know why she forgave us. Before Hai-Wen could ask more questions, Dr. Han Mi-Ray appeared at the basement door. She walked down the stairs, her feet still making no sound. The air around her seemed to bend, like heat waves on a summer day. It's time to tell them the truth, Mi-Ray said. She touched the wall, and the basement transformed. The concrete walls became screens, showing images of stars and distant worlds. Show her, Ta-min. Show her what you've learned. Ta-min stood up. His movements were different now, more graceful, like Myra's. Mrs. Park wasn't just a grandmother, he said. She was a watcher. Her people have been studying Earth for 10,000 years. They look exactly like humans because they helped create humans. Hei-Wen's notebook fell from her hands. On the wall screens, she saw images of beings that looked human but could change their forms. They walked among people throughout history, watching, learning, protecting. When they hurt one of us, Myra explained, our defense systems activate. The attackers are changed. They receive our memories, our abilities, our understanding. It is both a punishment and a gift. The other two, Hei-Wen said, Du-Han and Jisoo, they're changing too. Yes, Ta-min answered. I can feel them. Du-Han is at the construction site where He stopped, pain crossing his face. Jisoo is at her house, but she won't be there long. We're being pulled together. The change requires all three of us. Myra's form flickered, and for a moment, she was something beautiful and impossible. My grandmother chose to live as a human, to age like a human. She believed it was the best way to understand Earth people. But she was more powerful than any of you could imagine. The basement walls showed Mrs. Park's true history. She had helped shape human civilization, guided leaders, prevented wars. She had lived 1,000 lives, worn 1,000 faces, and in her last life, she had chosen to be a grandmother who made kimchi and helped lost tourists. Why didn't she stop us? Ta-min asked, his voice breaking. She could have stopped us easily. Because she believed in choices, Myra said softly. She believed humans must choose to be better. But she also believed in consequences. Suddenly, Ta-min grabbed his head and screamed. On the wall screens, they saw Du-Han and Jisoo doing the same thing. Blue light poured from their eyes and mouths. The final phase is beginning, Myra announced. Detective, help me get them all to the site. When the transformation completes, Earth will have its first 3 human watcher hybrids. They will be the bridge between our worlds. Hei-Wen looked at Ta-min, who now floated several inches above the ground. She thought about everything she had learned in the past few hours. The world had changed forever, and she was part of that change. Will they survive? She asked. Myra smiled, and stars seemed to dance in her eyes. They will become something new, she said. Something that both our peoples need. Above them, the sky turned purple as 2 moons became visible in broad daylight. The time of hiding was over. Detective Yoon Hei-Wen gathered all 3 teenagers at the construction site. Du-Han, Jisoo, and Ta-min stood in a triangle, blue light connecting them like electric bridges. Dr. Han Myra watched from nearby, her form shifting between human and something else. It hurts, Du-Han said. His voice echoed strangely, as if he spoke from far away. Every memory hurts. Good, Myra said firmly. Pain teaches. Watch now. Feel everything. The blue light grew stronger. In their minds, all 3 teenagers saw Mrs. Park's life playing like a movie. They felt every moment, every emotion. They saw her as a young girl in Korea before she left for America. They felt her fear on the long flight to Atlanta, clutching the single suitcase, knowing no one. They lived through her first day at an American school in 1960. They felt the sting of harsh words, the pain of being pushed aside, the loneliness of having no friends. But they also felt her strength, her determination to succeed. Please, Jisoo begged, tears floating up from her eyes like tiny blue stars. We understand now. Make it stop. No, Myra said. You must feel it all. Every year, every moment. The memories continued. They felt Mrs. Park's joy when she graduated from college, the first in her family. They lived through her marriage, the birth of her children, the death of her husband. They experienced her return to Korea, hoping to find home again. But beneath these human memories, they saw something else. They saw her watching humanity from the beginning. They felt the weight of her real age, thousands of years spent guiding, protecting, and loving the human race. She could have ruled the world, Ta Min whispered, but she chose to serve it instead. Du-Han fell to his knees. The baseball bat he had used was still there, half buried in the dirt. He touched it, and it turned to dust. "I was so wrong," he said. "We were so wrong." The blue light started to enter their bodies now. Their skin became transparent, showing galaxies underneath. They felt their minds expanding, touching thoughts and feelings that weren't human. Jisoo's phone floated out of her pocket. On its screen, the video of their crime played one last time. Then the phone dissolved into blue sparks that entered her chest. "The transformation is almost complete," Mireille announced. "Your human bodies are accepting the Watcher DNA that Mrs. Park transferred to you. Her memories will stay with you forever. Her knowledge will become yours." Detective Howon watched in amazement as the three teenagers began to float. Their bodies glowed like stars. Their eyes held entire universes. "What happens to them now?" she asked Mireille. "They will live between worlds," Mireille explained. "Not fully human anymore, but not fully Watcher either. They will feel the pain of everyone around them. They will understand hatred by having felt its consequences, and they will help others learn what they have learned." The blue light reached its peak. For a moment, everyone at the site could see what the teenagers saw: the endless stretch of space, the billions of worlds, the countless forms of life. They saw Earth as the Watchers saw it: precious, beautiful, and still learning. Then the light faded. The three teenagers settled back to the ground. They looked human again, but their eyes held new wisdom. When they moved, starlight followed their hands. "We're ready," Du-Han said, his voice deep with understanding. "Show us how to make things right." 1 week after their change, the three teenagers tried to return to normal life. But nothing was normal anymore. Their world had become much bigger and much stranger. Du-Han sat in his classroom, trying to focus on his mathematics test. But he could feel everything his classmates felt. The boy next to him worried about his sick mother. Du-Han saw the hospital room in his mind, felt the fear and sadness. 2 rows back, a girl celebrated secretly. She had won a music competition, but hadn't told anyone yet. Her joy filled Du-Han's mind with bright colors and beautiful sounds. "Du-Han," his teacher called, "your skin is changing again." He looked at his hands. His skin had taken on the exact shade of the wooden desk beneath it. When he moved his arm, it shifted to match the white paper of his test. The whole class stared at him. Across town, Jisoo faced her own challenges. She stood in front of her bedroom mirror, watching her appearance change. Sometimes her face looked Korean, sometimes African, sometimes European. Her body remembered every person Mrs. Park had ever been, every life she had lived. When Jisoo slept, she dreamed in languages that hadn't been spoken on Earth for thousands of years. At the local park, Tai Min discovered another new ability. A small boy had fallen from the swing set. Before anyone could react, Tai Min felt the child's pain in his own body. Blue light flowed from his hands without him thinking about it. The boy's scrapes healed instantly. Parents grabbed their children and ran. Someone called the police. When Detective Yoon Ha-won arrived, she found Tai Min sitting alone on a bench, crying stars that floated up into the sky. "I only wanted to help," he told her. "But they're afraid of us now." Dr. Han Mi-rae called an emergency meeting at the construction site that evening. The three teenagers gathered there with Detective Ha-won. Above them, the 2 moons still hung in the sky, visible only to those who knew about the Watchers. "Your powers are growing faster than expected," Mi-rae said. Her form shifted constantly now, as if she no longer cared about keeping up her human appearance. "The human part of you is merging with the Watcher abilities in unexpected ways. The whole city is talking about us," Jisoo said. "Someone posted a video of Tai Min healing that boy. It's everywhere now." "Good," Myray replied. Humanity needs to know they're not alone. My grandmother believed it was time. That's why she chose you three. Chose us? Doohan asked. But we attacked her. We killed her. Myray smiled, and her teeth looked like diamonds. My grandmother lived for 10,000 years. Do you really think 3 teenagers with a baseball bat could kill her if she didn't allow it? The truth hit them all at once. Mrs. Park had known what would happen. She had chosen them because of their hate, their fear of people who seemed different. By forcing them to change, she had changed the whole world. There will be more changes, Myray warned. Tomorrow, government officials will come. Scientists will want to study you. Religious leaders will have questions. Are you ready? The 3 teenagers looked at each other. Their skin shifted colors in perfect unison. In their minds, they felt Mrs. Park's memories guiding them, teaching them, showing them how to face what was coming. We're ready, they said together. Above them, the stars seemed to shine a little brighter, as if the universe itself was watching what would happen next. The Seoul Central District Court had never seen a case like this before. The courtroom was filled with government officials, scientists, and reporters from around the world. Detective Yoon Ha-won sat in the front row, watching as 3 glowing teenagers faced 2 different justice systems at once. On one side of the courtroom stood human judges in their black robes. On the other side, 3 watchers had appeared, their forms shifting between light and shadow. Dr. Han Myray stood between the 2 groups as a translator. This court will now hear the case of the people versus Lee Do-han, Kim Ji-soo, and Park Ta-min, the human judge announced. The charges are murder in the 1st degree. The Watcher Council also claims jurisdiction, one of the light beings said through Myray. These 3 now carry Watcher DNA. They fall under our laws as well. Do-han stood up first. As he spoke, his emotions became visible around him like colored clouds. We are guilty of a terrible crime, he said. We acted out of hatred and fear. But Mrs. Park gave us more than punishment. She gave us understanding. To prove his words, Do-han shared his memories with everyone in the courtroom. Suddenly, all present could feel what he had felt during the transformation. They experienced Mrs. Park's life, her pain, her forgiveness. Several people began to cry. Ji-soo spoke next. The video she had recorded played in the air above her head. But now it showed more than just what her phone had captured. It showed Mrs. Park's thoughts in her final moments, her deliberate choice to allow what happened. She knew who we were, Ji-soo explained. She knew we needed to change. She chose to sacrifice her human form to make us understand. The watchers moved closer, their light filling the courtroom. Our laws are clear, they said. Any human who harms one of us must face the consequences. But Mrs. Park already enacted those consequences. The transformation is both punishment and rehabilitation. Tai-min stepped forward last. His skin cycled through all human colors as he spoke. We stand ready to help others learn what we have learned. We ask not for forgiveness, but for the chance to make things right. The human judges whispered among themselves. The lead judge looked troubled. This court has no precedent for this situation. The defendants have already been transformed. They show clear remorse. They have abilities we don't understand. How can human law judge them? Perhaps. Detective Ha-won spoke up. We need a new kind of justice, one that serves both worlds. Myray nodded. The Watcher Council proposes this. Let them serve both societies. Let them work to prevent the kind of hatred that led to their crime. Let them be the bridge between humans and Watchers. The judges from both sides withdrew to consider the proposal. In the courtroom, Do-han, Ji-soo, and Tai-min waited, their forms glowing softly. Through their new abilities, they could feel the mix of fear, wonder, and hope in everyone present. When the judges returned, their decision would change more than just 3 lives. It would set the pattern for how humans and Watchers would interact in the future. Above the courthouse, the 2 moons shone brightly, no longer hiding from human eyes. 1 year after the trial, the 3 teenagers had become teachers of a new kind. They worked from a special center built where the construction site used to be. Dr. Han Mi-Ray called it the bridge because it connected the human world with the world of the Watchers. Du-Han stood before a group of students who had been caught bullying others at school. As he spoke, his skin changed to match each of their faces in turn. "Let me show you how it feels," he said quietly. He shared the memories of pain, loneliness, and fear that he had learned from Mrs. Park. The bullies felt everything their victims had felt. When the sharing ended, many of them cried and asked how they could make things right. In another room, Ji-Soo worked with police officers and judges. She helped them understand the people they dealt with every day. When she touched their hands, they felt the hopes, fears, and struggles of the people they arrested or sentenced. Many of them changed how they did their jobs after that. Understanding changes everything, Ji-Soo told Detective Yoon Ha-won, who often visited the center. Mrs. Park knew this. That's why the Watchers gave us this gift. Ta-min had found his own way to help. He worked with doctors at the biggest hospital in Seoul. His ability to feel others' pain helped doctors understand their patients better. Sometimes, when cases were very serious, he used his blue healing light. But he had learned to ask permission first. The light doesn't just heal bodies, he explained to the doctors. It connects people. After I heal them, they feel what others feel for a short time. They learn empathy. Dr. Han Mi-Ray watched over all of them. She had stopped pretending to be fully human. Her form changed freely now, showing her true Watcher nature. More of her people had revealed themselves around the world, working openly with humans for the first time in history. One evening, the three teenagers met in the garden behind the bridge. The two moons lit up the sky, now visible to everyone on Earth. Du-Han touched the ground where they had buried Mrs. Park, and blue flowers grew instantly. "I understand now why she chose us," he said. "She could have picked anyone to become like this, but she picked the people who needed to learn the most." Ji-Soo nodded. Her form sparkled with starlight. She knew that people who have learned to hate can also learn to love. And once they learn, they can teach others. Ta-min added, "She gave her life to teach us. Now we give our lives to teach others." Above them, a new star appeared in the sky. The Watchers had built a station there, where humans could visit and learn about their ancient guardians. Earth was changing. People were learning to understand each other in new ways. Detective Ha-won, watching from her office window, wrote in her notebook, "Today marks 1 year since we learned we weren't alone. 1 year since 3 teenagers died to their old selves and were reborn as something new. 1 year since hate turned to understanding." She looked up at the 2 moons and smiled. Somewhere out there, she knew, Mrs. Park was watching. And maybe, just maybe, she was proud of what her last lesson had achieved. 5 years had passed since the night that changed everything. The bridge had grown into a tall silver building that reached into the clouds. Its walls shifted colors like Du-Han's skin, and blue flowers like the ones from Mrs. Park's grave grew all around it. Inside her office at the top of the building, Detective Yoon Ha-won looked at old photographs. She had become the head of the new Human Watcher Relations Department. The 3 teenagers, now young adults, worked as her main team. "Another ship is coming," Du-Han announced as he entered the office. He no longer looked like the angry boy who had carried a baseball bat that night. His eyes held wisdom beyond Earth years, and when he moved, stars danced around him. Ji-Soo sat at her desk nearby, watching screens that showed events around the world. Her old phone, the one that had recorded their crime, sat in a museum now. It played their story on repeat, teaching others about change and forgiveness. "The ship brings more teachers," she said. "The Watchers think Earth is ready to learn bigger secrets." Ta-min walked through the wall, something they could all do now. In his hands, he carried a glowing blue sphere. "Mrs. Park's memories are reaching the end," he said softly. "Soon they will fade completely, and we'll only have our own." The 3 of them had spent 5 years sharing Mrs. Park's memories with others. They had helped stop wars by making leaders feel each other's pain. They had healed ancient hatreds by showing people their shared hopes and fears. They had changed the world, one person at a time. Dr. Han Meiray appeared in the room, her form now completely watcher-like, made of light and stardust. "My grandmother would be proud," she said. "You have taken her final lesson and turned it into a movement that spans worlds." Outside the window, the two moons shone brightly. Between them, the new star sparkled, the Watcher station where humans went to learn about the universe. Earth had changed so much that sometimes people forgot what it was like before. "Remember when we thought we were punishing her?" Du Han asked his friends. "But she was giving us the greatest gift anyone could give." Jisoo nodded. "She gave us the ability to truly understand others, and she trusted us to use it wisely, even though we had hurt her." Tan Min touched the blue sphere, and it showed them Mrs. Park's face one last time. She smiled at them, and they felt her love and forgiveness wash over them again. "The hardest lesson," Tan Min said, "was learning that change starts with those who need it most. She chose us because we were lost in hatred. She knew that if we could change, anyone could." Detective Ha-won wrote in her final report, "5 years ago, 3 teenagers committed a terrible crime. Today, they lead humanity toward a future none of us could have imagined." Mrs. Park's death opened a door between worlds. Her forgiveness taught us that understanding is the key to peace. As night fell over the city, the 3 former teenagers stood on the roof of the bridge. Their bodies glowed with starlight as they prepared to greet the arriving ship. Above them, millions of stars twinkled, no longer distant and mysterious, but full of friends and teachers and endless possibilities. The legacy of one wise grandmother, who had lived as a human to understand humanity, had changed not just 3 lives, but 2 entire civilizations. And somewhere, in the endless dance of stars, her spirit washed over them all, proud of what her final lesson had achieved.